Okay, and this was originally supposed to be Jim Anaya. So I am Jim Anaya playing Patty Limerick, who is playing Charles Wilkinson. Okay. That will be your introduction, Patty. We have here with us today David Wilkins, who you'll see in your program is formerly of the University of Minnesota and now with the University of Richmond in Virginia. He's a citizen of the Lumbee Nation. He has adjunct appointments and full professor appointments at various universities and is the author and editor of a number of books, including Documents of Native American Political Development to Present, Red Prophet, The Punishing Intellectualism of Vine Deloria Jr., Dismembered, Native Disenrollment and the Battle for Basic Human Rights, Hollow Justice, Indigenous Claims Against the United States, The Navajo Political Experience, The Hank Adams Reader, and The Legal Universe, which he wrote actually with Vine Deloria Jr. We also have Kent Blansett, who is Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Shawnee, and Potawatomi. He is an associate professor of history and Native American studies at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. He also serves as the founder and executive director for the American Indian Digital History Project. He too has produced numerous articles and book chapters, including When Stars Fell from the Sky, the Cherokee Nation and Autonomy during the Civil War in San Francisco, Red Power and the Emergence of the Indian City. So without further ado, we have our three panelists, and our topic today is Vine Deloria Jr., leader, influencer, and mobilizer. Thank you. I guess we'll start, David, with you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you. I want to thank Patty and Jim Anaya for putting this together and for bringing us all here to talk about our good friend, Vine Deloria Jr. As we all know from Vine's incredibly diverse research, writing, and teaching portfolio. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. He was one of the most curious human beings the world has ever known, and he had a zest for knowledge that knew no boundaries. I first met him in the summer of 1975, but came to know him much better in the fall of 1980 when he encouraged me to enter the unique master's program that he had developed down at the University of Arizona, Federal Indian Policy, under the rubric of political science. It was a 2-year period that really set me on the intellectual path that I've been traveling ever since. Dan already sort of stole my thunder by talking about being a Deloria disciple, because in those early years when we were part of those initial cohorts, that's what we called ourselves. Not because Vine was a holy person. He was anything but that. But we knew that if we worked hard and engaged the vast materials that he and the other faculty had prepared, that we'd be ready to take on the forces that continue to negatively impact our nations and our lands. Vine had a clarity of mind and spirit that came from his respect for the knowledges and values of natural peoples, his love and respect of the land, his quest for the truth, his belief in honesty, and his impeccable integrity. And as one of the earliest and most steadfast supporters of Eastern Native peoples, including my nation, the Lumbee, Vine was someone I had known well before I ever met him, having read Custer, like many of you, and got his read as a college student in the early 70s. Ultimately, all of what Vine did in his public life was about engaging in actions and the development of legal, political, educational, and cultural strategies that were designed to improve the conditions of all Native peoples, recognized and non-recognized, treaty and non-treaty, urban and rural, mixed bloods, full bloods, and all peoples for that matter, and for the restoration of an ecological ethic that respected the earth as our actual, not merely symbolic mother. The second to last of Vine's 30 books that he wrote before he passed, The World We Used to Live In, that we've heard quite a bit about today, which came out in 2006, continued his tradition of providing clear advice to Native peoples about that most important of questions. How do we relate to the natural forces of the world? And where do we go from here? Another posthumous book, a comparative analysis of Carl Jung and the Lakota people, titled C.G. Jung and the Sioux Traditions, came out in 2009. And his last book that I had the honor to co-write with him, The Legal Universe, came out in 2011. How remarkable is that? Vine was so prolific that his books were still coming out 6 years after he walked on to the other side. While Vine sometimes discounted the importance of his prodigious and original works, calling them ad hoc and spur-of-the-moment political tracts, he also and much more accurately stated that if one read his scholarship in the context of his life, it was possible to, quote, see a persistent effort to lay down certain kinds of strategies for political action which are consistent from start to finish. And they would be alerted that it is in the actions of my life that theories and ideologies are worked out. And I think that's a wonderful sort of summation of his approach for many of his works. In other words, virtually everything that Vine wrote was about providing directions, actions, and strategic plans to improve conditions for all Native peoples, other oppressed groups, and for the earth herself. I'd like to relate to you some of the broad outlines and suggestions offered by Vine in his voluminous works. In Destroying Dogma, Vine Deloria Jr. and his influence on American society, Dan and Steve Pavlik pulled together a number of writers in a volume in which we wrote to honor Vine. The piece I wrote was called Forging a Political, Educational, and Cultural Agenda for Indian Country. And in it, I went back through many of his writings and several of his testimonials and speeches and pulled out his recommendations in the fields of politics, law, history, and tribal government. And I divided the essay into two parts, his reform and suggestions for the federal government, but also for Native nations as well. And I asked Kurt to hand out the tables. You all have, at least many of you have, copies of these, I think. And these are found in the book that I'll mention in a little while. A few months before he passed in 2005, he returned the draft essay that I had written containing these wonderful recommendations. And he said in a note that I had read your article on my way to work yesterday as I was clearing out my files. It really is a major piece of scholarship and mind reading on your part. He went on and said, it occurred to me that after I'm gone and people my age have to think in those terms, that you could keep the article and update it, add a few well-chosen sentences from our correspondence, and have yourself a nice, quick book. Now, Vine's sense of timing, especially about publications, was always impeccable, and I always took to heart his suggestions. Red Prophet took longer to write than I wanted, but it was finally released last year by Fulcrum, and I'm really glad that Bob is here. And we saw images of the numerous books that Fulcrum has published of Vine. And while others have written essays that provide biographical details about Vine's life, and David Martinez just published a political study of Vine's 4 early works, little scholarship has been produced that focuses on his philosophical, political, legal, cultural, and economic recommendations for reform. My short book provides that important data within the context and format that Vine suggested. In Custer, for example, Vine outlined what I call the Delorian trilogy, which consisted of his powerful and original discussion of tribal sovereignty, his distinctive conceptualization and defense of the doctrine of tribal self-determination, and his clear description and analysis of the environmental sacredness that we've been talking about all day. This trilogy of concepts set the stage for a life of ideas, reforms, and suggestions that, if ever fully implemented, would go far towards the alleviation of what ails much inside and outside of Indian country. In his later works, most notably his robust study, The Metaphysics of Modern Existence, he added to this trilogy by discussing 2 additional terms: interdependence or interrelatedness, and maturity that we've heard mentioned a few times today. In fact, for Vine, maturity may well have been the most important concept. As proof of this, he was interviewed in 2000, and he was asked, what then to an Indian is the ultimate goal of life? And Vine said, maturity. The ability to reflect on the ordinary aspects of life and discover their real meaning. And he went on and elaborated on that, but it's too long. We only have a handful of minutes. So with this as a backdrop, I won't go through the list of suggested reforms. You'll be able to read those for yourself. but I would like to highlight a few that have particular relevance for Eastern Native nations. It's important to note that some of his ideas have in fact been implemented, or at least partially put into play, at both the federal and tribal levels. Ideas such as to train Native judges to understand both tribal and federal law, engage in land claims restitutions for nations who unjustly lost their lands or who were underpaid for them. That Congress should promote Native self-determination, which it did in the passage of the Indian Self-Determination Act of 75. That the U.S. should resolve legal and moral liabilities for Indian massacres, like Sand Creek, which was finally made a National Historic Landmark. That Congress should create block grant programs so that tribal governments could have more flexibility to spend their own monies. This came to pass with the Indian Self-Governance Act in the early 90s, and that's been implemented and expanded. That Congress should address and seek to rejuvenate the Indian land base. Congress has tried to do this with the Indian Land Consolidation Act, and they've made some progress, and partially via the Cobell class action lawsuit. That Native governments should adopt policies to clarify and structure what social scientists would be allowed to research. He laid that out quite graphically, did he not, in Custer? Many tribal nations have adopted such policies, and the several federal agencies have adopted consultation policies, which should actually be expanded to consensual policies, because consultation is not consent, right? And finally, and that Native governments should hire full-time lobbyists and have them placed in every state capital, as well, of course, in D.C., to improve Native-state relations. And we're seeing more numbers of Native tribes hire and create and train their own lobbyists and have them represent their interests at both the state and the federal level. And finally, that Native peoples must assert control over their own education. And we now have, 37, Dan, tribal colleges around the country, and those numbers continue to grow. In Custer, Vine stressed that Congress should enact a policy that would respect the inherent sovereignty and dignity of Native peoples, and a cultural leave us alone agreement in spirit and in fact. And it was also in Custer where he let Eastern Natives know where he stood. He said Congress should enact a blanket law recognizing the status and rights of Eastern tribes and their right to organize under the Indian Reorganization Act. And he also wisely added that federal services could then be made available to those long-ignored tribes on a contract basis that would have enabled us to eventually attain a measure of economic self-sufficiency. And Eastern Native nations are still struggling in their own ways to get their particular relationship established with the feds. Another major issue for Vine in Indian country was a split of urban versus reservation and Eastern versus Western tribal communities, caused in large part by federal policies of removal, relocation, termination, and extreme poverty conditions. Vine pressed for the formation of Native coalitions that would bring these separate but related groups together in a way that would have created a measure of unity, thus forcing the BIA and other federal agencies to accept their obligations to all Native peoples, not only reservation-based Native peoples. One particularly brilliant idea he proposed would concentrate its attention on the coordination among the non-reservation peoples and the reservation programs on a regional or area basis. In that way, migration to and from urban areas could be taken into account when planning reservation programs. This reeks of common sense, but we've not been able to make it happen yet. Finally, in one article, he addressed what has become an intense issue for many Native peoples, the ongoing tension between those individuals who have generally assimilated into the larger socioeconomic system and those who seek to retain and practice traditional values and ceremonies. Vine always had the greatest respect, of course, for traditionalists, and there was a respect that heightened over the years, but he also called upon those individuals to acknowledge that, quote, the basis of Indian tribal religion is not simply preserving old social forms and ceremonies, but creating new forms and ceremonies to confront new conditions. This is one of his greatest strengths, and encouraging us to keep moving forward while drawing from our past. This perspective Vine held was crucial given that indigenous customs and beliefs had been shaped by particular times and places, and in order to be meaningful, religious traditions must be maintained, quote, must must he maintain, relate to a dramatically changed community in a dramatically changed environment. Vine believed that traditional people could understand this concept since, quote, tribal religions were not dependent upon the teachings of saviors and because truth manifests in the ever-changing experiences of the community. He then uttered a line that reflected his core positive belief in the inherent sovereignty of every Native community. He said, "The shape of the Indian future cannot be imported, either from Washington or from other struggles for social change. The major question," he said, was, "What shall be the true and accepted meaning of the tribe?" Although it was at the time thought of as a quasi-political entity, and some wanted it to become a more viable economic entity, we had that with the gaming tribes. For Vine, his hope that was, quote, the tribe might once again become identified at its core as a spiritual and religious community. Since we are all serious about improving the situation of each Native nation and our relations with states, the federal government, and the international community as well, and doing more to protect and live with the environment, then it would behoove us all to spend time dwelling on and then responding to the many ideas that Vine spelled out in these two tables and in his many other works. In the broadest sense, these powerful, timely, and interconnected suggestions and policy reforms would strengthen indigenous nationhood, but would also fortify the notion of the U.S. as a pluralistic democracy, home to not one but many democracies, including those of our nations, striving to fulfill the needs of their citizens and maintain amicable relations with other political bodies. As noted, some of Vine's ideas have found their way into law, policy, and popular discourse, but it is clear that many of his suggestions have not yet been acted upon by Native nations or state and national lawmakers. In assessing the current state of Native America in virtually every sphere, it is striking how relevant and timely many of these suggested reforms are. The fact that we have not thus far acted upon the majority of his ideas is cause for some dismay, but that they have been proposed and retain all their potency to improve the human and environmental condition is exhilarating. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, relatives. Thank you for having me here today. I want to say a special thank you to Faith for starting us off, at least in this session, with a good heart and a good place with that prayer today, this morning. That meant a lot. And I think it's given us a good wave to ride on all throughout this afternoon. And I want to thank more particularly Patty Limerick and the Center of the American West, as well as all the staff for making this happen. This has been just a dream of mine, kind of as a young fan of Vine all of my life. And part of that fandom was it took me a long time to be able to write my own book, which was A Journey to Freedom, and kind of trying to twist that notion of Custer Died into a new kind of response in the sense of talking about what does it truly mean to be free as Native peoples. Moving forward in today's talk, I really struggled. I really related to Patty's opening words. In fact, admittedly, not only did I really struggle to organize my comments for today, but I struggled around the idea of summarizing within 10 minutes Vine Deloria Jr. as a leader, as an influencer, as a mobilizer. I mean, how and where do you begin to summarize the life of an individual that was perhaps one of the greatest Native intellectuals of the 20th century, or a phrase that I've been echoing from all the panelists of today? When I saw the symposium schedule, too, it read literally like a who's who's list of accomplished Indigenous activists, writers, lawyers, and historians. As the youngest, I really began to panic. How do you go at least into this and make a significant contribution, let alone the fear sets in when I'm last following everybody, fearing that as I go through my notes today, all the things that I wanted to say was already going to be covered. So luckily, I managed to go through my notes here, and I think I'm okay, but there's a lot of parallels and twists here, which I think great minds think alike, so this is a good thing. So one of the things I started to come to is I started to ask myself, well, what would I tell my own students? and the sense of researching Vine, where would I tell them to start? Well, in graduate seminars, I always say, well, why don't we start with the book reviews, right? Why don't we start with how were people basically talking about this book when it came out in 1969? So I elected to do just that. I elected to jump feet first down this rabbit hole. And I was genuinely curious to see how other Native scholars in the 1960s and 70s began to review Custer Died for Your Sins. The first review that I found was from a Cherokee lawyer, and it caused literally my jaw to drop on the floor. Joseph C. Muskrat reviewed Vine's book for the American Bar Association Journal in December of 1969. He wrote, and I quote, "Vine Deloria Jr., a law student at the University of Colorado, has managed in 279 pages to present the reader with some of the most outrageous nonsense and muddled anthropological thought ever to appear in print. When he is right, he is generally right for the wrong reasons. Interspersed is a never-never world of unstructured analysis, straw men that the author consistently erects and then destroys, metaphysical nonsense, and an obvious confusion on the part of the author to do precisely what the issues are. If the reader is by now thoroughly confused, perhaps he can take comfort in the fact that Mr. Deloria is too." I was like, oh my gosh. But as, just having my book come out, I was thinking, it can't get that bad. So it was kind of helpful too. It was kind of, stimulating in that kind of regard. In other words, I was stunned after getting through this review. And this was, just as caution, this was one of the worst reviews I'd ever read. Then I thought maybe that's just a lawyer thing. I mean, it was the American Bar Association. Perhaps it's going to get better. Surely the next one, right? Well, the next review I read and came across was from Okewenge Pueblo anthropologist Alfonso Ortiz, who at that point in time was teaching at Princeton. His review fit the definition of what some academics call a praise sandwich. Two pieces of praise wrapped around a very thin layer of negativity. Quote, "This is one of the most ambitious and most successful overviews of contemporary American Indian affairs and aspirations I have ever read." That's the praise. "Although all academic specialists in the Indian world also be well advised to scrutinize the book's contents carefully." A little bit of negativity, right? "Specialists are not likely to be satisfied with Deloria's coverage," end quote. I was like, wow, oh my gosh, how did Vine react to this? Well, Alfonso's review was far better, obviously, than Muskrat's. Ponca historian Roger Buffalo had, in a November 1970 review, literally piled on the negativity in the praise sandwich metaphor. Quote, "Vine Deloria has produced a witty, provocative, and sometimes crotchety interpretation of the past and current state of affairs of American Indians. While this approach is commendable and has some validity, there is, to quote one man who knew Deloria very well, a lot of bullshit, on which much of the approach rests. On the whole, Custer Died for Your Sins is a worthwhile and much-needed contribution to the literature on American Indians. Pardoning Deloria for excesses here and there, the book must be judged the most thought-provoking and exciting study of American Indians in recent time." In other words, a giant praise sandwich that was handed by Roger Buffalo Head. What I soon realized, the book had also just come out. I was used to, at least having been a fan of Vine Deloria, expecting, well, who could not like his work, right? Well, that was interesting, because the book had just come out, and Vine Deloria was the new kid on the block, attempting, at least in writing, a kind of long journey of publications that would then follow after Custer Died for Your Sins. And this will kind of make sense as I move forward in this. After the brutal exercise of reading through some of Vine's academic reviews, I decided to track down the actual book numbers. I was really curious. How many copies, at least, have been sold over the last 50 years of Custer Died for Your Sins? I mean, what is the hard data, if we were to look at this? Well, in this quest, I began contacting OU Press. Now, OU Press has the current print rights for Custer Died for Your Sins. They've had these for since at least 1988, of which Vine Deloria's book over the last 31 years have sold a grand total of 87,000 copies. And that's just since at least 1988. So I was curious. I mean, they couldn't give me any of the numbers from Macmillan, so I called up Macmillan, only to be transferred, obviously, to Simon & Schuster, who had bought out Macmillan. And of course, as of today, they are still searching, at least for those numbers. So I will have to report back to you after the conclusion of this conference on those numbers. But with fair certainty, I can say something. That Custer Died for Your Sins has sold, at least steadily, at a rate in the last 50 years. And of course, if we were to use that steady rate in the comparison with OU Press, it would be at least well over 150,000 copies that have been sold, at least around the world. As these numbers reveal, most are at least already aware, at least, of his books far surpass the expectations bound within these early reviews. And beyond the critics, Deloria also wrestled with another hurdle beyond the reviews. In the 1970s, his book actually was banned. It appeared on several major censorship lists, along with other titles like Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice, Hinton's The Outsiders, or even Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. Now, it's fascinating to me because sometimes being on the censored list can also help you sell more books. Readers, in other words, don't like to be told what to read, especially because they can decide this for themselves. Well, I still at least waited for the press to locate the early sale numbers of Vine's book, and I was sweating at this point because the date was approaching for me to come here. I got a little sidetracked and hung up on another term, the influencer term, which today has a really peculiar meaning, especially when we consider we're in this digital and social media age. I mean, how many people follow you on Instagram or how many likes you accumulate on social media has some sort of, bearing today. And I always kind of wondered what Vine's take on all this would have been. And I really wanted to at least test out a couple of theories, especially as a digital historian, on at least a fascinating app called Google Trends. Now, for those of you who have never used Google Trends before, it provides users with data sets that are reported on a month-to-month basis. And it charts this data over a significant period of time in order to demonstrate how a particular search term or individuals are trending on Google. Now, this application is fascinating because it can track search results all the way back to 2004, roughly the last 15 years. So I imagine that in the future, historians will scour through thousands of hashtags, tweets, and also perhaps Google Trends to write biographies. But putting the future aside, I got a little carried away, primarily because one can also use this app to compare different individuals or events and how this data trends over time. So I was curious. Did Vine Deloria have more search hits than George Armstrong Custer? I literally thought, oh, wow, I just created a digital little bighorn. Unfortunately, I'm sad to report Custer still trended higher than Vine. Now, that's a call for action. My hope is that events like this will actually change that trend in the future. Before giving up on what I thought might be a great hook for this talk, I remembered a story from my own research on Richard Oakes. Cree songwriter and musician Buffy St. Marie once stated that in a 3-minute song, she could reach far more people than Vine Deloria ever could in 300 pages. And sure enough, Buffy, based on Google Trends data, was right. Since 2004, Buffy St. Marie has indeed trended higher than Vine Deloria. So what does all this data mean? Does it tell us anything about how people interact with that data? Well, this is perhaps best left to the next generation of digital scholars moving forward. So next, I began to turn to my own bookshelves. And I picked up a book that I remembered had a very cool photo of Vine wearing a sweatshirt. It was a rare photo that I remembered because he wasn't wearing his glasses in this photo. This black and white image was captured by Andrea Medeka, and it appeared in a limited edition coffee table book in support of the American Indian College Fund. When I opened up the book, I'd also stumbled upon a great story. It was a story of how Macmillan Press inspired the publication for Custer Died for Your Sins. From 1964 to 1967, of course, Vine Deloria, as we know, served as executive director for the National Congress of American Indians, or NCAI. And on one occasion, while he was in New York City to advocate for social justice issue, an editor at Macmillan reached out to Vine and asked him to lunch. Now, I'd like to imagine, at least in my mind, that this place might have been like Seinfeld's Monk's Diner, right? It probably was Lion's Head, but I pictured it in myself in my head as being kind of Monk's Diner, and the Formica tables, endless coffee, and of course, a smoky haze coating the room, partly from Vine's own non-filtered Pall Malls. In this vision, his Macmillan editor leans over and cuts to the chase with a perspective offer to the author. Would you be open to writing a book about contemporary Indian affairs for Macmillan? Vine leans back with a slight smirk and says, what qualifies me to write a book for your press? Is being Indian enough? The editor, to his surprise, said yes, and cut him a check in advance for $500. And this was good money, mind you, in the 1960s for an unpublished author. It provided Vine, at least at that time, with enough money for him and his family to live off of while he attended law school here at the University of Colorado. Now, once in law school, he kind of forgot all about the New York meeting. Only thought of the book after completing his first year of law school. After a year without anything to show Macmillan, he began to think about what he would write and about kind of what he was initially thinking about is he was wanting to take the Bureau of Indian Affairs to task, at least from a Native perspective. A short little diversion into at least Vine's Indian humor. He told this joke once in an interview, and it's always stuck with me ever since. It's one of my favorite ones, and it kind of, I think, summarizes the launching point for Custer Died for Your Sins. In this joke, in his typical swagger, he said, before Custer went to the Little Bighorn, he literally stopped by the BIA, and he said, "Don't do anything until I get back," end quote. On that note, Vine Deloria, quote, wanted non-Native people, and this is in his own words, he wanted non-Native people to understand the ongoing malfeasance of the United States government and its relationship to American Indian nations. I wanted to humanize Indians, to go beyond the stoic stereotypes prevalent in U.S. culture, and to allow others to understand our perspective. Over the next few months, he would quickly pound out a couple of chapters on his typewriter. He would send them to his editor back in New York. And then when he arrived at the Macmillan building to at least meet and talk about these chapters, he feared that his editor would think his writing was too angry or too radical for mass appeal or marketability. When he approached his editor's office, he decided actually against opening the door and walking right into his office. Instead, Vine kind of stood there safely behind the glass door and waited for his editor to literally throw the chapters back at him. To his surprise, once his editor noticed him at the door, he quickly jumped up from his desk and greeted Vine with praise for his chapters. Vine was given another $500 check and went home quickly to be able to finish the rest of the book. Now, the book would ultimately sell out in its first 2 print runs, and it received praise from popular critics. After Vine finished law school, he would have decided that he didn't want to practice law, but he elected instead to become a full-time writer. In the interview, he went on to state, quote, writing, though, I wanted to do. I had found at least a way to develop issues in a wide variety of areas, to identify a pattern and gather data to see if it has any substance, and to discover things that have been missed by others. Writing was, and still is, the best tool I can think of when it comes to challenging the norm, end quote. Now, growing up in the Ozarks, my high school library literally had only 2 books on Native history. We had Vine Deloria's Custer Died for Your Sins and Thurman Wilkins' A Cherokee Tragedy. Now, during the early years of card catalogs prior to the invention of the internet, I thought these were the only 2 books on Indian history that existed in the world. We didn't leave the Ozarks very much as kids. And I literally read these books cover to cover. I wore them out in our high school library. Vine's book at least became my escape. His book became my inspiration. And in the end, his book became my salvation. During my freshman year at the University of Missouri, the first place I went had been the E-Stacks of Ellis Library. It was rumored, at least, among all the Native students that John Neidhart's ghost supposedly still walked among the stacks, or the E-stacks, at Mizzou's library, or Ellis Library. So you always had to keep an eye out for if John Neidhart might be peeking over your shoulder. And I'll never forget the discovery, the first time ever I saw those E-stacks. Because I came from a world in which I thought there was only 2 books on Indian history, and all of a sudden I found rows and rows and rows of Native history books. I realized that Vine had written more than just Custer Died for Your Sins. And I was like a kid in the candy shop. I cracked open not only his book, but I cracked open all the books that Vine had written. And I spent literally the first 2 years of my undergraduate between those 2 E-stacks within Ellis Library. I would pull those books off the shelf. I took voracious notes, and these became my own Native Studies courses, learning from at least some of the greatest minds of the 20th century. And naturally, the first author, of course, and the only author that kept at least kind of a constant in my life was Vine Deloria's works. I devoured all of them. His writing inspired me, at least at that young age, to serve as president of our Native American student organization. And at that point, I decided, at least along with others, that we would lead a 4-year struggle for the return of over 3,000 of our ancestors' remains that were housed at the University of Missouri. I relied upon the newly passed legislation called NAGPRA, or the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And after many public demonstrations and protests, bringing in at least Dennis Banks and Mike Haney from Oklahoma AIM, our small group of students managed to make change. We forced at least the university to issue a public statement showcasing their commitment and devotion to repatriating all of our ancestors back to a repatriation site in the state of Missouri managed by the Iowa tribe of Oklahoma. Beyond activism, Vine Deloria's book inspired me to become a historian and to continue at least my research on Red Power well after I graduated. I finally met Vine Deloria when he came to Albuquerque when I was in grad school at UNM, and he came in for doing a book signing. Now, the indigenous nerd that I am, and for me, this was like meeting Stan Lee right at Comic-Con. I had packed literally every one of his books into my backpack that I could fit in, and I piled them in at least on the table of his signing table, only to have Vine turn his head and say, "I have to sign all of those?" And yes, it was a form of endearment, that teasing, that uncle inside of him that just made you feel welcome with that booming laugh. It was not every day that you get to meet your heroes. At least for this shy Indian kid from the Ozarks, that was a day I'll never forget. As a recent first-time author and fearful of reading my own reviews eventually, I soon realized that no one really remembers the bad reviews at the end of the day. No matter how bad the reviews or the censorship he faced, Vine Deloria wrote the book that he wanted to write, and one that needed to be written in that moment in our history. It was an unapologetic narrative that could wake America up and get Americans to finally acknowledge their true treaty and legal obligations to indigenous nations and peoples. Finally, I would argue that the real objective of Custer Died for Your Sins was an attempt to decolonize all Americans. In other words, we weren't the only targets of colonization. My concluding piece of evidence is from Edward Abbey's New York Times review, one that Phil had posted up earlier. It was a review that was published literally 11 days before the Alcatraz takeover, and quite prophetic. Within the last stanza of the review, his ending point that Ed Abbey wanted to issue out for the rest of the country to know about this phenomenal book. Quote, "As for Mr. Deloria, he has written a good book. Not one about Indians and their troubles, but about us and our troubles. Custer Died for Your Sins is even better than its title." Thank you.
Taken notes when Charles Wilkinson told me stories about his friendship with Vine. And I do know for a fact that that was one intense friendship. And I know that I was a little proud when Vine gave me one of the cassettes with the country western music in it. And I think I might have bragged about that to Charles, who had 5 cassettes by that point. So Well, all righty then. They've been together for a long spell. So I think my channeling of Charles, I may not try quite so much of that. But I want to say a few things about having him as my friend and colleague. He was on the third floor of Helms, and he had a couple of couches in that office, and his tradition of office hours was, I think it has to be unique. Maybe other people do it. I haven't seen it. He would come from his class with maybe 9 or 10 students who just, I don't want to call them ducklings, but they had that quality. They would just troop behind him over to the office. And then they would get into various postures and reposes. Some of them would get a chair, but hardly any, I guess, would get a chair, but they'd be on sofas and be on the floor. And then he'd just do a salon. I mean, eat your heart out, Gertrude Stein, at that point, because it was a wonderful thing to see that symposium that took place there. And sometimes I snuck in. He smoked, and so I still have a peculiar attitude towards smelling indoor smoke. I usually, if I'm in a wouldn't happen in a restaurant, I guess. As he said, he had many remarks about Boulder restaurants where you had to step outside to smoke. I could quote some of those, but they're not really appropriate for public audiences. But my conditioned reflex to this moment is that if I walk into a classroom building and smell smoke, I think, Vine's here. So that's unusual attitudes for a person from Boulder to be so happy and moved at the smell of cigarette smoke. So I wanted to talk about him as a teacher just for a moment more, that he had an exercise for all this stuff about active learning, which we now have been chattering about in higher education for a couple of decades. He had, for instance, an assignment. He taught the American History Survey class. He taught American Indian History, but he also taught the whole general survey class. And when he got coming up on the 1920s, Phil, correct me, but I'm pretty sure that I have this right, that he would assign each student in the class, and there could be 200 people in the class. They would each have to find a person, an African-American, Mexican-American, American Indian, Asian-American, who had made a hit in theater, music, or sports in the 1920s, who had really made an impact with that. So they were to find one of those folks and research the hell out of that individual, and then come to class for a couple of days that were just an ongoing symposium and workshop. And of course, the point of that was that for all of the revival of the Klan, new version of the Klan in the 1920s, for all of that, things were happening in American race relations that you would not notice if you just followed the presidents or the members of Congress or the operations of the Klan. So I don't totally know if that's where Indians in unexpected places might have come, a tiny unit of that might have come from that assignment. Well, it came from the Pawnee roller skater. Well, of course, I should have known that. But it was a congruence, or it was a coincidence of some kind that was pretty cool. I kept thinking I would end up with some techniques that would be as brilliant as that for involving the students, and I did not over the years. But that was a wonderful thing to watch. Then I had a few things I wanted to say about his. One of them I probably should keep to myself, I guess, but I did mention it to a couple of people last night. Well, first I want to talk about how I saved our colleague Richard White from Vine's anger. Richard White is a very noted Western historian at Stanford, and he is very accomplished, and he writes extraordinary books. There's no one better on our team than that. One day, I smelled smoke, and I came happily up the stairs, and Vine was on a tear. And he was very mad at all of my closest friends in Western American history. He was really mad at Elliott West for saying that the acquisition of the horse by Indian people had reduced the grazing resource in river valleys and thereby weakened the bison. He was really mad about that. And because Elliott West was my friend, I was quite guilty and implicated in that. So that wasn't good. And then he went on to Richard White, that Richard White, he said, had never met an Indian. He was writing all these things about Indians. And there at least I had something to say, and which happened to be true. So because Richard White and I had gone to Santa Cruz together. He was 3 years ahead of me. I would have known him, except I would have met him when we were at Santa Cruz, except I did not, because he was not at Santa Cruz. He was taking independent studies from Santa Cruz, and he was spending all his time supporting the fishing rights protests. He was doing independent studies, sitting in muddy, rainy locations. And so when Vine, with Elliot, I'm afraid I might have just betrayed Elliot. I probably just stayed quiet on that one, didn't really jump in there for my friend. But with Richard, I thought, I have this one. And so I talked about the fishing protests. I talked about how Richard, in fact, had been a witness and probably to this still moment is an important witness in cases involving shellfish, especially for tribes on. So very proud of myself. I pulled Richard White from the line of fire and put myself in the line of fire, because then we had to turn to my flaws and my failures, which were significant and vital. But I still am a little bit proud that I pulled Richard from the line of fire and thereby got it myself. So one of the other stories I was going to tell, and I did mention it last night, others. So Jeff Limerick, and I want to get back a little bit to that. 2 more points I want to make after this. So Jeff Limerick and Vine were very fond of each other, and Jeff had designed our house, and Vine brought, I'm pretty sure that Rick Williams was in that group, and Ward Churchill was in that little party. This was in the early 90s. So we knew that Vine was coming by with a couple of friends. So we go to the door, and there's Vine, and I knew Rick Williams already, so there's no introductions necessary there. We know each other quite well. And then he said, and I knew Ward a little bit, so then Vine points to Ward, and he says, and here's Russell Means, in your dreams, Ward. Which we had to have been there, but that'll stay with us. One more just personal observation. What to me was really interesting about those reviews, I met a whole slew of people in 1981 at the Sun Valley Conference. I beg your pardon, I misspoke. In 1983, the Sun Valley Conference anticipating the 50th anniversary of the Indian Reorganization Act. So I met a slew of people at that. That's where I told Vine that I had used his book at Harvard, which went poorly. But I met Alfonso Ortiz, I met Roger Buffalo. All those folks were there at that conference. And I don't know what happened to those reviews. If it's not only that the readers forget the reviews, but the writers forget them as well. As far as I could tell, Alfonso and Vine were pals. So it just makes me wonder why we go to the trouble to write those damn reviews, because they're gone. Though they're very quotable. I appreciate you're getting that. So then I do want to say that the Center of the American West was founded by Charles Wilkinson and me at a time when we both knew Vine quite well. I was on the board of the Sun Valley Conferences, the organization Richard Hart, the anthropologist who's worked closely with many tribes, had founded a little board, and so I got to know Vine through serving on that. When he went through that long endurance thing with the implants, the tooth implants, which, oh boy, so he was very brave and very noble in taking that on. When I had my own implant, I thought, I can live up to Vine standards here for that. It's quite a tormented thing. Anyway, he was so impressive and so wonderful, and we got to be quite good friends through that. So that when we were founding the Center of the American West, I had a bunch of different thoughts in mind about what applied history might be, what it might mean to be doing history in a way that, well, many people were saying all through the day, of connecting with people whose lives are involved in that history. So the fact that Charles Wilkinson was the one who persisted in doing the paperwork to create the center. I got discouraged. I'm not good at forms. And I said to Charles on one really cold day, too much work, too many forms, let's give it up. And Charles said, I'll do it. I'll stay in there. And as I say, I should write Charles Wilkinson a fan letter, letter every day. But I think that there's no question that we had Vine's work as a leading, there's so many reasons to claim him for so many good causes, but I think for us at the center, the applied history work that he was doing, never used that phrase, never needed to use that phrase, but I think that's an inspiration. And so in that sense, the very fact that we had an organization that could organize this event, it just loops around. So my last comments, I wanted to say something about his kindness. And then I wanted to, well, okay. So he was really fond of Jeff Limerick, my late husband, and Jeff had a stroke in 1996. He was only 48 years old, and in the intensive care unit, which is kind of my home for a little bit there, Charles Wilkinson came with a very delightful hatch chili pepper tree, which really wasn't what we needed at that time, but I do remember him bringing that. That was really good. And then Vine and his wife came because they were afraid that I wasn't eating, so they took me out to lunch or dinner so that I would be eating. Then, when Jeff got out of the hospital, Vine called and said that he wanted to be the first person to take Jeff out to lunch when he was able to do that. So as soon as Jeff could go out to lunch, we got set, and school had started. I was crazed. Jeff couldn't be left alone for very long. It was very hard. But I came home, I picked up Jeff, and we were going to go meet Vine, and I drove Jeff and me to the wrong restaurant. And then I got there, I thought, I'm in the wrong restaurant. So we tracked Vine at the right restaurant, and so he was very kind, and he got in his car, and Vine drove over and had lunch with us. And for the rest of his life, so that meant almost 2 decades of this, every time I was going to arrange to meet with Vine, he would say, all right, Dr. Limerick, you're telling me to go to this restaurant. Which restaurant are you going to go to? So that just was not going to end. That did not end. It didn't end. There are many reasons why I'm really, really, really happy with this event today. But one reason is that I was not able to attend the memorial service for Vine because I couldn't be in Golden because I had agreed to be at the University of Portland to give a speech. And so I had to do that. So missed the memorial. When I got to the University of Portland, they said, we've been looking at our class schedule, and we see that the Plains Indian History class is tomorrow, and you have open time there. So would you mind speaking at the Plains Indian History class about Vine Deloria? I said, I'd love to do that. So I did. And as it settled in, I realized I would be going to that Plains Indian History class at exactly the same time that the memorial was starting in Golden, even with the time change, precisely the same time. And I could hear the voice. I could hear, Dr. Limerick, so you've gone to the right time at the wrong place again. That's what you've done again. So today, we have all been at the right place at the right time. So thank you.
On the future of print publishing industry, now that people are doing things on their Kindles or Google or whatever, how does that affect the media coverage and the popularity of such books, as you've mentioned?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's changing accessibility because it's also making it cheaper. For me, digital was kind of a revolution. I really wanted to get involved with it by creating the American Indian Digital History Project, and part of this is kind of in Vine's legacy, which was we digitized all of Akwesasne notes, and we put them in their original form. We made them searchable, and then we're entering the metadata so you can actually do detailed searches of Akwesasne through the whole period of its run. And that way you can see every article that was ever done on the Navajo Nation that appeared in the Akwesasne notes over time. And so these become new ways in which we can take our publications and be able to have different dialogues and discussions. And more importantly, we can take those rare publications, which it took me going between 2 different coasts and 5 or 6 different archives to finally read a full set of those. But now they're open so that students don't have to do that same kind of traveling. They're right there and they're accessible. One of the other future trends of that is to create a treaties app. So kind of doing the work of the treaties, but make it to where it's an app on your phone. And so you can just search all the treaties that were abrogated and all the treaties even that came after 1871 that even weren't ratified. You still have those treaties that you can search, and as a tribal member or representative, if you're going before government, you can pull up that treaty and search it by keyword and go right to the stanza, right to the article that you need to cite. And I think that's kind of where the future is taking us in positive directions. And yeah, I think it's changed the world for university presses in general too. The New York houses versus the university presses in the sense of profitability margins and what they can do for authors has also been a very interesting issue that all of us have been kind of talking about in circles, and kind of what's going to happen in the 21st century with publishing.
And I guess I would say that Vine's style and Custer Died for Your Sins is very compatible with our world today. I'm delighted that I was born at a time when they did not have the diagnosis of attention deficit disorder, but boy, would I have been a candidate. I'm not good. If I'm given a very big tome to read, there's as much despair as there is in a freshman's heart at that moment. It's a very big tome. Perhaps if I divide it into little sections and put Post-its in between the things. So I am really of the fragmented attention span and have been that, I guess, all my life, which makes the Center of the American West a great place to work because we never concentrate on anything. We just are thinking of different things all the time. But I think there's, in a weird way, I think it's very compatible with what we have now of that don't expect people to settle in for the long haul. And so I actually think this comes, Custer Died for Your Sins, kind of comes around to where attention span is these days of no tomes, please. And the humor thing, of course, I think is a huge part of that. So should we maybe...
Wrap up. I wanted to mention one thing. This Google data thing is pretty cool. And in the in-between here, I noticed that the Sioux tribe, the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, actually defeated Custer for a second time in 2016-17 with their Google hits. By a lot. By a wide margin.
Yeah, I'll add that to the talk. That's a good one. Yeah, no, and I think that's, the other signpost of digital for us in creating the Digital History Project was what we really also wanted to extend out to was to reach out also to tribes and start digitizing tribal archives and what tribes would want the public to know. And part of this is to get kind of like what Mark Trahant was saying this morning, to get actual reporting that's based upon those sources, but is accountable to having the latest research possible. And the amazing thing with putting that out there was we started getting people writing us from Germany and England, like young students that were like, oh, thank you so much for putting this up online. I couldn't make it to America to be able to do this research. So it's almost that, kind of effect of transforming the world, but also indigenizing the world and kind of using that as a tool for decolonization in another way. So it's kind of exciting to see where the potentials go with that.
I think we should finish the panel.
So this is it. We're closing off the session here with this panel, and we're moving on to the student presentation. Is there a break or no?